nothing that breatheth. But thou shalt utterly destroy them. He then lists several of these tribes. And here he tells you why in verse 18 of chapter 20 of Deuteronomy. That they teach you not to do, one of the key words, after their abominations, another key word, which they have done unto their gods. So ye sin against the Lord your God. That's who sin is against. It's against God. That's what Joseph would say in Genesis 39 whenever the woman tried to get him to commit sexual sin and adultery. He said, how can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And then, of course, in verse 19, you see the idea here of preservation of the trees. He said, you go into the land, don't just cut down every tree. Cut down certain trees, but keep some of the trees so that you can have them for food later on. And so you see this idea of conservation, if you will, as opposed to just utter waste. I have written down here Luke 16:8b, which talks about the children of this world sometimes are wiser than the children of light. You know, just because we're members of the church doesn't mean we should be stupid or silly or not use our heads. And certainly we should use our heads. It's like people today that act like, all the global warming stuff is true. That's a bunch of junk. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't take care of things or throw trash on the ground or act like we don't have any responsibility at all when it comes to decency. The Bible doesn't teach that. It teaches we should be decent in caring people. We don't lose our mind either way. And you see some of that even in the Old Testament here. Also, let me just say this, going back up to verse 18. I've written a note in my Bible. A man's religion affects his actions either good or bad. A man's religion affects his actions either good or bad. James 1:27 speaks of what kind of religion? Pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father. But in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse number 12 and following, 2 Peter chapter 2, verse number 12 and following, and these are religious people. In fact, they were members of the church who had fallen away and were false teachers. Well, how do you know that? Because verse 15, they have forsaken the right way. 2 Peter 2:15, you can't forsake something you were never in. But then he says up in verse number 12, of these false teachers, these who have corrupted religion, but these as natural brute beasts, made to be taken and destroyed, speak evil of the things that they understand not, and shall utterly perish in their own corruption, and shall receive the reward of unrighteousness as they that count it pleasure to riot in the daytime, spots they are and blemishes, sporting themselves with their own deceivings while they feast with you. Talking about these fellowship meals, and these false teachers were among them. Verse 15, having eyes full of adultery, and that cannot cease from sin, beguiling unstable souls, a heart that is exercised with covetous practices, cursed children, which have forsaken the right way. So I thought about that as I go back over to Deuteronomy 20 and verse 18, and this idea of false religion, or a man's religion, good or bad, affects their actions. If it's proper religion, it's going to affect the way they live. If it's false religion, it's going to affect the way they live. What you think affects what you do. You agree with that? I think everybody would agree with that, hopefully. Okay, then you get into chapter 21. Yes, sir. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, thank you for bringing it up. That's a good point. In fact, by that verse, I've written down Judges 7:3 and following. Think about those that were, he called the people that were going to go into battle because their heart wasn't in it, if you will. Revelation 21:8, the fearful are condemned. Very good point. Very, very good thought. Anything else before we go to chapter 21? Yes, sir. Oh, good deal. Good. That's real. Oh, I love that, Ray. Let's get a little practical. What would be false religion for us? You talk about in the Church of Christ, right? In the Lord's church. Yeah. What would be false? What's some examples of false religion for us, practically speaking? I could think of some. Say what? Corruption of the worship service. What if we were to sing during the Lord's Supper? How are you going to sing and memorialize the supper and meditate and contemplate at the same time properly when you're examining yourself and all the things that are involved there in that meditation as you remember? You can't do two. Would we pray and preach at the same time? No. What about having a choir or a solo or a duet? What about putting a piano in the building? Or having, outside of the worship, even you had women elders or women deacons. Or a woman lead a prayer, a lady wait on the table, or a man who's unfaithful and an ungodly man wait on the table. There's many ways you could corrupt worship. Thank you. And we could just keep going with examples. That's a great point. All right, chapter 21. If you want to break down the chapter, here's a quick outline, okay? Verses 1 through 9 is going to deal with laws about unsolved murders. Again, this is various laws, chapter 21 to 26. 1 through 9, unknown murder. Verses 10 through 14, the rights of a prisoner's or of a prisoner wife. Verses 15 to 17, right of the firstborn of a hated wife. 18 through 21, punishment of a rebellious son. And 22 through 23, prompt burial of those who are executed. And so I'll kind of go through those as we go through them. So verses 1 through 9, unknown murder. Here's what you need to understand as we go through this section. Innocent life matters to God. Proverbs chapter 6 in verse number 16 and following, one of the things he lists there that God hates is those that shed innocent blood. This section is dealing with someone that had been murdered. No one knows who did it. I mean, why don't we just move on, right? Throw the guy in a bar ditch and be done with it. That's not what God says, because life matters. All life matters. Look at chapter 21, verse 1. If one be found slain in the land, which the Lord thy God giveth thee to possess it, there's again God's grace, lying in a field, and it be not known who hath slain him, then the elders and the judges shall come forth, and they shall measure unto the cities which are round about him that is slain. And it shall be that the city which is next unto the slain man, even the elders of that city shall take a heifer which had not been wrought with, and which had not drawn in the yoke. And the elders of that city shall bring down the heifer into a rough valley, which is neither eared nor sown, and shall strike off the heifer's neck there in the valley. And the priests, the sons of Levi, shall come near for them. The Lord thy God hath chosen them to minister unto him, and to bless in the name of the Lord. And by their words shall every controversy and every stroke be tried. And all the elders of the city that are next unto the slain man shall wash their hands over the heifer that is beheaded in the valley, and they shall answer and say, Our hands have not shed this blood, neither have our eyes seen it. Be merciful, O Lord, unto thy people Israel, whom thou hast redeemed, and lay not innocent blood unto thy people Israel's charge, and thy blood shall be forgiven them. So shalt thou put away the guilt of innocent blood from among you, when thou shalt do that which is right in the sight of the Lord. There's a lot of lessons that jump out here if you really think about this section of Scripture. Number one, every person's life matters. That's what I see here when I read this Scripture. And so here's a person no one knew who did it. It wasn't just to be taken lightly. There was to be investigation into this thing. And then, of course, you'll see the respect that's given to the dead, even regarding this sacrifice. Even if it was symbolic or whatever was involved in this to get potential atonement or all the things going on here. But one of the things also that jumps out to me is the leadership's responsibility. These elders had to take responsibility for the things that were done in their area. And so city officials have to take responsibility for a city, county officials for a county, people in the government for a state or for the nation. Just like an eldership takes responsibility for a congregation and the things that happen in that local congregation. All those lessons jump out to me when I think about these verses. You're going to see it again in chapter 22 with the responsibilities of leadership. Notice also how all life matters. Genesis 9:6. You might want to write that down by verse 1. What does Genesis 9:6 say? And if someone's looking that up to read it, Brother Mowdy would be good. I'll go ahead and read Deuteronomy 19:10. I'll just skip back there. It speaks again of innocent blood. That innocent blood be not shed in the land, which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance, and so blood be upon thee. What does that say, Genesis 9:6? This is why life matters.
Whoso sheddeth
Okay, we could talk about abortion, which is a fancy word for murder of babies. That's a heinous, heinous thing. We could speak about euthanasia, which is a fancy term for basically killing old people. Assisted suicide, genetic engineering and manipulation of the way God made human beings in order to change them and defile them and manipulate them and so forth. So many lessons that we see here from this principle of innocency. Yes. Genesis 4:8, very good, yeah. Yes.
And so here, because the justice couldn't be laid on the person who committed it, it's defaulting, like you said, to the responsibility of the local government to mitigate that guilt.
We're going to see this in a minute. The people have a responsibility too. But if this congregation were to leave the faith, who's held responsible first? The eldership. Who's held responsible second? The membership. Okay, everybody's going to be held accountable for that, but it starts with the leadership. And so you see these things. In verse 5, you have these Levites which were responsible for giving this investigation. And here's what I've written by verse 5. Justice matters. They wanted to make sure that God's law was followed. And so justice, following the scriptures correctly, is a big deal. Life matters. We could keep going. Again, you see this idea of verse 6, and all the elders of that city, not just some, all the elders would bear this responsibility. And innocent blood is a wonderful thing in God's eyes, and we should not take these things lightly. You know, there's crime for manslaughter. You may kill somebody accidentally, and even we just covered the cities of refuge. Even if you accidentally killed somebody, what did you have to do? Flee to a city of refuge, and you would have to stay there maybe the rest of your life. And so there's still consequences even when it's an accident. Life is a precious thing, and we don't need to take that for granted. And then you have in verses 10 through 14 the rights of a prisoner wife. Now you read some of this, you say, oh, I don't know about some of that. Well, it's actually good when you really think through it and think of that time period. Here's what I've written by verse 10. With the true brutality of other cultures, I want you to see the brutality of those Canaanite cultures compared with God's love, even in what he's writing here. Because I'm going to tell you something. When you study through this, the temple prostitutes, both men and women, that were involved in literal fornication as part of their worship services, some of the most vile defilement and things you've ever seen. There's even tribes in other countries to this day that, I'm trying to think how to say this in a good way, that will abuse in some of the most unthinkable ways women, as an example, so that they're not able to enjoy, let's say, sexual activity even with their own spouse or with anyone else. Think of that kind of nastiness that was going on in Canaan when they went in to discipline these people through God's judgment. You see some of a little bit of this also back in chapter 20, verse 13 and 14, where it talks about the males were to be utterly eradicated, but the women and the little ones could be kept. I believe there's actually mercy in that because some of them couldn't help the decisions that were being made for them. Verse 10, when thou goest forth to war, I'm in 21:10, against thine enemies, and the Lord thy God hath delivered them, again, God's grace is almost in every verse, into thine hand, and thou hast taken them captive, and seest among the captives a beautiful woman, and hast a desire unto her, that thou wouldest have her, notice what? It's a big phrase. To wife. So if you were going to take this woman in the spoils of war, she had to be treated a certain way. And in fact, if you study history, oftentimes when there was going to be a captivity that would take place, many of these women would actually dress up. And they would fix themselves up or whatever, if you will, to look more beautiful so that they could be taken into someone's home as a wife and not be, killed or whatever. And then verse number 12, it says, then thou shalt bring her home to thine house, and she shall shave her head and pare her nails. Well, there's debate on, does that mean she cuts her nails, she grows her nails out? Is this dealing with putting off the heathen customs? Is it giving time for her to get out of that mindset? I think all that may be involved. Verse 13, and she shall put the raiment of her captivity from off her, and she shall remain in thine house, and bewail her father and her mother a full month. Let me tell you something. There was no law of that time, no Canaanite law that would ever let anything like that happen. Look at the decency involved in this. It says, and after that, thou shalt go in unto her, here it is, big phrase, and be her husband, and she shall be thy wife. And it shall be, if thou have no delight in her, then thou shalt let her go whither she will. Notice the freedom that would be allowed in that. But thou shalt not sell her for money. Thou shalt not make merchandise of her, because thou hast humbled her. And so I would simply say, Jeremiah 10:23, there's a way that seems right to a man, the end of, or the ways of death. That's actually Proverbs 14:12. It's not a man that walks to direct his own steps. That's Jeremiah 10:23. There's some things you read about in Deuteronomy, and you think, man, I'm not sure. Let me just tell you something. Trust God. God knows what he's doing. He put these things in place, and these are some of the most just laws the world has ever known in that situation, and God deals with the reality and the practical of these things. Verse 11, women can be beautiful, and of course beauty's in the eye of the beholder. The Bible speaks about beauty being a thing that's dangerous. Proverbs 6:25, don't look on her beauty to lust after her, but also a good thing, right? Sarah was beautiful, and so I think every husband would think his wife is beautiful, if he should think that anyway. Yes, go back to Leviticus, Exodus, so forth. Yes. Right.
And so a general law is being given here.
Yes.
And then there's exceptions to
Right.
it. You know, you marry a woman except for this, and this.
Right. In fact, if you go back to chapter 20, that's what you have there. There are these women that were acceptable, verse 14, as opposed to the women and others that were not acceptable, verse 16 and 17, right, that utterly had to be destroyed. Here's what you need to understand. Remember that sermon last Sunday about Job and God knows better than we do? Don't ever put yourself in a position of trying to judge what you think is best when God has stated something. When God says something, let me hear y'all hear me on this. When God says something, it is right, no matter what you understand about it. And that's the problem people get into. Well, I just don't understand why God. Whoa. Go read Job 38 through 41, and maybe just lay your hand upon your lips and not try to get into things we don't understand. Deuteronomy 29:29 says the secret things belong unto God. Think about this and think about marriage in heaven. There's neither marriage nor giving of marriage in heaven. So you're married to someone for 50, 60 years, and yet in heaven you're not married. You'll know each other. You will know you were married, but in heaven you're neither male nor female. You're as the angels are. Yet you remember that you were married and you were a male on earth. You'll remember all that, but it'll all be different. And so trying to understand that, in fact, it's so appealing for some people to want to be married through all of eternity. The Mormons have invented a doctrine that says if you get married in one of their temples and wear certain undergarments, you can be married for all time and eternity. Some women look at that and they say, man, that would be fantastic. Other women look at that and say, wow, that would not be cool. All I know is this much. We don't understand all of that. I can tell you right now, from a personal standpoint, I kicked the bucket. My wife has a right to remarry, and she remarries someone else. I personally don't like that at all. And I told her, don't bury him by me, because I'm going to kick him in the head on Resurrection Day. And she said, if you do, you're going to go to hell. I said, I know, so don't bury him by me. It's too much temptation. But at the same time, if she were to remarry, I would wish him the best, because that's what the Bible teaches. I can't rely on what I think, right? So when you go through this, it doesn't matter what you think. Or I think it matters what does God say. And this is the old law, and so there's principles there. Not all the things are same in the old versus the new, but there are principles. And also God was also forbearing with people early on. At the times of this ignorance God winked at, but now commands all men everywhere to repent. All right, we got to hurry on. Verses 15 through 17, the right of the firstborn of the hated wife. Now hated here, I don't believe means hated in the sense we usually use it. I believe hate is used in the sense of Luke 14:26, to love less. He loved her less than he did the other wife. Again, God did not command them to have two wives, but he allowed them to have more than one wife in the early stages of humanity. That was all stopped and taken back to the Garden of Eden by Jesus in Matthew 9, referring back to Genesis 2. But it says here, notice God's justice. Verse 15, Deuteronomy 21. If a man have two wives, one beloved and another hated, again, think love less. Luke 14:26 commentary on that. Genesis 29, 16 and 17, Rachel and Leah. And they have borne him children, both the beloved and the hated. And if the firstborn son be hers that was hated, again, love less, then it shall be when he maketh his sons to inherit that which he hath, that he may not make the son of the beloved firstborn before the son of the hated, love less, which is indeed the firstborn. But he shall acknowledge the son of the hated for the firstborn by giving him a double portion of all that he hath, for he is the beginning of his strength. The right of the firstborn is his. Now, what I've simply written here is situation ethics aren't okay. God's law is to be upheld, and you can't show favorites. You could go back and look at Genesis 49:3, Genesis 25:31 and 33, and get background information on some of these things. But here's what you need to understand. God's justice is seen here, just like the leadership principle was seen in chapter 21. When you read this, don't just look what they were under, but look at the principles for us. All right, verses 18 through 21. Punishment of a rebellious son. If a man have a stubborn and rebellious son, and we're not talking about a 5-year-old here, which will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and that when they have chastened him will not hearken unto them, then shall his father and his mother lay hold on him, both mom and dad are involved, but then later it's just going to be the dad and the elders, and bring him out unto the elders of his city, again, responsibility of the leadership, and unto the gate of his place. And they shall say unto the elders of this city, this our son is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. Notice how he defines rebellious here. He's a glutton and a drunkard. Again, we're not talking about a 7-year-old, a 5-year-old. We're talking about one old enough to understand. Think teenager type person upward. And you study Old Testament history, those under 20 were not punished. Those over 20 were going into the Canaan land. I don't know what exact age was involved, but this is someone under their oversight, but certainly old enough to make sinful, wicked decisions and wouldn't change from it. And it says, notice verse 21 here, not just the elders, all the men of his city shall stone him with stones, that he die. So shall thou put away from among you, and all Israel shall hear and fear. You can go back to chapter 21, verse 2 and 6. Again, you see the eldership responsibility. There's many verses in the Old Testament regarding spouses. Parents and children. Proverbs 30. Somebody go ahead, Kyle, would you read Proverbs 30, verse 11, and also 17? Proverbs 30, 11, and 17. And then, Josiah, would you read Exodus 20 and verse 12? Proverbs 30, verse 11, and verse 17. Pretty serious. Okay, Exodus 20, verse 12. So there's lots of verses like that in the Old Testament. The New Testament says that children are to obey their parents in the Lord, for this is right. 1 Timothy 5, this isn't about parents, but it is about older versus younger. Do you know the Bible addresses the attitude we're to have to those who are older? 1 Timothy 5, 1 and 2 talks about that the younger is not to rebuke an elder. That doesn't mean an elder in the church. It means an older man. And it also, they're to treat the older women as mothers, the younger women as sisters. So all of these teachings on respect, and this is on parents, are taught in the Old Testament and certainly reiterated and taught in the New Testament. This is one of the reasons I believe, out of study of Titus 1 and 1 Timothy 3, that a faithful child would involve one old enough to obey the gospel, at least having one of those, because it talks about that they be not accused of riot and unruly. And that's not little children, but you can study that another time. I've covered that. Verse 21, here's this phrase again, the end of verse 21. It's over and over and over. So shalt thou put away evil from among you. Point number 1. And all Israel shall hear and fear. Point number 2. You could go back to chapter 19, verse 19. Put away evil. 19, verse 20. So that Israel shall hear and fear. In Acts chapter 5, verse 1 and following, you see the same thing. Ananias and Sapphira were struck dead. Why? Number 1, to put away the evil from among them. And number 2, if you read Acts 5, I believe it's about verse 11, what does it say happened? Great fear came upon the church, and the church grew. Okay? So when you're dealing with discipline in the Old Testament, it's a big deal. Discipline in the New Testament's a big deal. Can I just say this before Wes makes probably a good comment? And that is, discipline in the home matters, discipline in a school system, discipline in a city. If you don't have discipline, you know what you have? Chaos. Brother Wes? No, that's a good point. And then now take the opposite of that. Have you seen people that play favorites to their children and their children are spoiled? And does that ever end well? That does not end well. You are creating a scenario where your child is going to be in trouble and other people are going to be in trouble because they see that. And I'll say, I mentioned this earlier, parenting, here's a good advice, one word, free of charge, consistency. If you are not consistent with your children, now listen to me, and I want to say something else, I want to be very clear. If your children are small and you never discipline them, and let me just make myself plain, if you never whip them or lay something on their rear end, you don't believe the Bible, so just throw it away. The book of Proverbs is as clear as it can be. It says if you don't chasten your son, you hate him. Well, I don't believe in that. I believe putting him in a timeout, sitting him in a court. Fine. Then go ahead, look in the mirror and say, I am God and God is not God. Either you believe the Bible or you don't. It's that plain to me. I am not talking about abuse. I don't believe in abuse. Abuse is condemned in the Scripture. But if you don't discipline your children, you can just mark it down. You don't believe the Bible, and the chances of them making it spiritually are very, very low. Any thoughts or comments or points you want to make before we go to the last few verses of chapter 21? Oh, yeah. I'm trying to see you. Yeah, he's good. Yes. So it can be a positive thing as well. So I see all the godly people here today, and the couples and the older people and the younger people, and y'all love God and you're trying to do right. That's an encouragement, and I think that's what Regis is pointing out, which is an excellent point, to do right. Okay, and it doesn't mean there's not mistakes that are made. I was thinking about disciplined children point. Hebrews 12 says what? You have fathers who discipline you, and oftentimes they didn't do it correctly. You ever got a spanking you didn't deserve? You ever not get a spanking when you deserved one? Okay, right? We can all say that. Have you ever seen abuse? Yes, that's terrible. I was in, I mentioned this before, but I was in methods in college. I had a business degree, but I did a secondary education kind of emphasis. And I was in a class, and this guy was going crazy about corporal punishment in the school system. And I realized, though, after talking to him, his dad had been abusive to him and mean and beat him. But my dad had whipped me, but my dad loved me. And so I had a biblical background of love and discipline. He just had a background of a person that wasn't doing what the Scriptures teach, and so he didn't understand. And so, therefore, there was confusion on the way we viewed things. Okay, then the last two verses of chapter 21. This is dealing with hanging someone on a tree, particularly punishment. I mean, a prompt burial of the executed. Also, I think you could study this as well as other contexts, because this is drawn on in the New Testament in Galatians 3:13, though applied maybe a little bit differently. And let me say this too, and maybe this isn't the best text to do it, but it brought my thought to it. There's oftentimes in the Old Testament where there'll be a context. In the New Testament, there's an absolutely different context, but a principle is applied, okay? And that is something the Scriptures teach that we need to understand, which is kind of what I'm doing as I teach this class, is I'm trying to bring principles out that fit, even if they're a little different, the idea of the principles being taught. You might want to write down Galatians 3:13, 1 Peter 2:24, beside verses 22 and 23 for some later commentary. Chapter 22. Okay, chapter 22, You have verses 1 through 12. These are various social laws that are going to be given, 1 through 12. And then 13 through 30 are laws about sexual conduct. So I want to cover this chapter. Chapter 22, verses 1 through 13, there's kind of different social laws given here again as he continues in this greater section of 21 to 26. Thou shalt not see thy brother's ox or his sheep go astray and hide thyself from them. Thou shalt. I'm saying that to make an emphasis again. Thou shalt not. Used all throughout the Pentateuch. Things you do, things you shouldn't do. Positive commands, negative commands. Thou shalt not see thy brother's ox or his sheep go astray, and hide thyself from them. Thou shalt in any case bring them again unto thy brother. And if thy brother be not nigh unto thee, or if thou know him not, then thou shalt bring it unto thine own house, and it shall be with thee until thy brother seek after it, and thou shalt restore it to him again. Verse 3, in like manner shalt thou do with his ass or donkey, and so shalt thou do with his clothing or raiment, and with all lost things of thy brothers which he hath lost, and thou hast lost, and thou hast found, shalt thou do likewise, and mayest not hide thyself. Thou shalt not see thy brother's ass, that's his donkey, or his ox fall down by the way, and hide thyself from them, and shalt surely, here's the key word, help, I circled that, help him to lift them up again. All right, let's talk about these first few verses here. Galatians 6:10 in the New Testament says what? Right, as we have opportunity, let's do good to all men. So this section is dealing, we would say common sense, but it's dealing with animals, buildings, clothing. You might want to write down Leviticus 19:18 beside this. It's taught in the law. Again, you would say, Jason, this is common sense. Well, it should be. Matthew 22 says what? Love your, 22:37 and following. Part of it there says, love your neighbor as yourself. Brother Miller? Yeah. Now, there are some principles in other places that if they can't find the owner and so forth, there's ways you can keep a certain thing. But yes, as a general rule, certainly if you're basically, oh, that looks good, I'm going to kick that kind of under my car seat here. I guess, not your car seat, somebody's in there with you. But a seat, if you're hiding something because you're going to go take it, that's theft. That's stealing. And so stealing, theft is a sin in the New Testament. Ephesians 4, let him that stole, talking about your former life, let him that stole steal no more. That applies to money, stuff, a man's wife, etc. And so we see here the idea of helping people. The golden rule, can we say the golden rule, Matthew 7:12, do unto others, in essence, I'm paraphrasing, as you would have them do to you. Okay, I love that word help there in verse 4. Also, if you want to take notes by verse 4, write down Exodus 23, 1 and following. There's several verses in Exodus 23 that'll bring this out even more, or where it was originally taught. Verse 5, the woman shall not wear that which pertaineth unto a man, neither shall a man put on a woman's garment, for all that do so are abomination unto the Lord thy God. Let me just go ahead and read a little bit. If a bird's nest chance to be before thee in the way, in a tree or on the ground, whether they be young ones or eggs, and the dam sitting upon the young or upon the eggs, thou shalt not take the dam with the young, but thou shalt in any wise let the dam go, and take the young to thee, that it may be well with thee, and that thou mayest prolong thy days. When thou buildest a new house, then thou shalt make a battlement, think about a railing, for thy roof, that thou bring not blood upon thine house, if any man fall from thence. Remember innocent blood again? Verse 9. Thou shalt not sow thy vineyard with divers seeds, lest the fruit of thy seed which thou hast sown and the fruit of the vineyard be defiled. Thou shalt not plow with an ox and an ass, it's a donkey and an ox together. Verse 11, thou shalt not wear a garment of divers sorts, as of woolen and linen together. We'll read verse 12 in just a minute. Look at all these assortment of various laws. What is all this about? Can I just say one thing? I think the overarching theme is, don't be like other people. Don't be like the world. And think of the background of the Canaanites. Some of the things that they had going on with these different, like for instance, you can go to Leviticus there, and it says, seethe not a kid in his mother's milk, or a goat in his mother's milk. They would take a baby goat, take the mother's milk, and boil it in that, I think it dealt with some of their beliefs of fertility, of planting crops. There's a lot of heathen paganism stuff going on here, and he's basically saying, don't be like that. I think that's some of the background. We had a comment, I think, back here. I thought I saw somebody raise their hand. Yes, that's very good. You know, Brother Miller, you think about common decency. I mean, someone drops something on the floor, a stranger, and you reach down to pick it up and hand it to them. Or again, being, just common decency and kindness. And we would say today, that's being a Christian. Now, people that do it may not be Christians, but they're applying Christian principles, and they're actually applying even Old Testament principles of decency. Can we just say this? This whole thing is, number one, practical. It's so practical. Think about the railing on the building. You go to Acts 10, when Peter was praying, Acts 10, verse 9. Again, you see that kind of setting. Because what he's saying is, why would you, if you don't do this, someone falls off top of that roof and they kill themselves, and maybe you didn't show even common decency in trying to be considerate of other people. And I think some of that is involved in the way we would do things safely as opposed to foolishly. There's many verses you could look at in this section. I've written down Exodus 23:19, Exodus 34:26, Leviticus 18:22, and so forth. There's many verses. Let's go back up real quick to verse 5. This idea of wearing a woman's clothing, or a woman should not wear a man's clothing, a man should not wear a woman's clothing. Where is that eventually going to lead when people start doing that kind of nonsense? Confusion. The next step, we've seen it in our life. We actually saw things I thought I would never see. There's clothing, and then there's the pursuit sexually of the other person, of the same sex. Then there is the mutilating of the human body, where we have, again, men trying to transition into a woman trying to transition to a man. And so you think back to this, what does it hurt? It matters. Let me tell you something. Is it just me? Or do we now live in a place, sometimes I can't tell if a person is a man or a woman on first glance. Sometimes I cannot tell. Most time I can. But if people can't tell if you're a man or a woman, you probably need to do something different. And I don't mean probably, I mean you need to do something different. You need to look like a man or, I look at an audience full of people, I can tell you're a man or a woman. But there's some places I'm like, I'm not real sure. Is that a man or is that a boy or a girl? I don't know. Somebody had a thought? I thought I saw a hand again. Yes. The attire of a harlot, Proverbs 6, we can tell a policeman or a soldier by what they wear, a fireman. Very good point. Yes. And really it goes back to 1 Corinthians 11. There's a difference in men and women. And I'm thankful for that. Aren't you thankful for that? I'm very thankful for that. And, Brother Hall the other night my wife wouldn't let me tell it in class, but, where the name woman come from, he said woman means out of man. That's true. But I think it also comes from, because when Adam saw Eve, he said, whoa, man. Never mind. Yes, probably said it not in English. Okay. The point is, there's a difference in men and women, and be thankful for that. That is my point. Be thankful there are differences. There's differences physically, but let me tell you, there's also differences psychologically in the way that we are made by God. And when it talks about the man being, stronger than the woman, the way that they're built, I'm telling you, mentally, psychologically, women are different. They need to be cared for, taken care of, nurtured, protected. All right, we got to hurry. Verse 12. You might want to write down by verse 12, Numbers 15, 37 to 41. Numbers 15, 37 to 41. These fringes were to remind them of God's law. And so they would do things to give them a physical reminder of that. Deuteronomy 6, they would put these placards and signs up. And of course, even today, I love it in a home when you see scriptures on the walls. And That's a beautiful thing. Verses 13 through 30 can all be titled laws about sexual conduct. If a man take a wife and go in on her and hate her, and give occasions of speech against her and bring upon an evil name upon her, and I say I took this woman, and when I came unto her I found her not a maid, think a virgin, then shall the father of the damsel and her mother take up and bring forth the tokens of the damsel's virginity unto the elders of the city. Again, leadership's involved too. And the damsel's father shall say unto the elders, I gave my daughter unto this man to wife, and he hateth her. Anyway, this tokens of damsel's virginity deals with, again, some blood on a cloth and so forth when a woman has sex for the first time, and they would produce. So apparently she took this, gave it to her father to keep it, to prove she was a virgin, and if this man lies about her and says she wasn't a virgin, the father says, oh yes, she was, you're lying. Okay? Notice how serious this stuff is in verse number 17. And lo, he hath given occasions of speech against her. That also tells you it's a bad thing to lie about somebody. Saying, I found not thy daughter a maid. That's a big deal too if she wasn't. And yet these are the tokens of my daughter's virginity. And they shall spread the cloth before the elders of the city, and the elders of the city shall take the man and chastise him. You can go to later on in this book and talk about beating them and whipping them, as I think was spoken of here. And they shall immerse him in 100 shekels of silver. He had to pay a fine and get a whooping. And give them for lying. And give them unto the father of the damsel, because he brought up an evil name upon a virgin of Israel. It's a big deal to lie about a person, their reputation. And shall be his wife. He may not put her away all his days. There's a punishment for that too, in the sense that he's going to be several punishments, about 3 punishments there for his lying. Verse 20, but if this thing be true, and the tokens of virginity be not found for the damsel, then they shall bring out the damsel of the door of her father's house, and the men of her city, not just elders, men, shall stone her with stones, and that she die, because she hath wrought folly in Israel, to play the whore in her father's house. Fornication is a serious sin, from Old to New Testament. So shalt thou put away the evil from among you. It's warned about constantly in the New Testament. These people who became Christians may have lived that way. They could not live that way as Christians. What does he say in 1 Thessalonians? Flee fornication. It says in another place, let it not be even named once among you as becometh saints, regarding this and other things. Yeah, oh yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. Verse 22, I'm going to try to get through 22 today, chapter 22. If a man be found lying with a woman married to a husband, so think about adultery, then they shall both die, both the man that lay with the woman and the woman. Here it is again, same phrase. So shalt thou put away the evil from Israel. The end of verse 24, last sentence. So shalt thou put away the evil from among you. Going back to verse 21, put away the evil. That's the point of all this. So go back up to verse 23. You have the death penalty there for this adulterous situation, which, by the way, tells you John 8 was a setup because there was no man there. That's why Jesus did what he did in John 8. Not that he's justifying adultery, but he knew it was a setup and there was no man. They weren't obeying the law anyway. Verse 23, if a damsel that is a virgin be betrothed unto a husband. Now that's engagement, but even more, they were considered married, but they had never been together sexually. And a man find her in the city and lie with her, then shall ye bring them both out of the gate of the city, and you shall stone them with stones, that they die, because the damsel cried not in the city. In other words, it's implying she was complicit in this. She went along with it. Because he hath humbled her, being his neighbor's wife. So shalt thou put away the evil from among you. Verse 25 deals with a betrothed damsel. Verse 28 deals with one not betrothed. And the point, one of the things it speaks about in here is if someone's in the country and there's a scene of rape going on, then that man's to die and not the woman, because it wasn't her fault. She couldn't do anything about it. And he's to die and she wasn't to die. And then there's one where she's not betrothed. I think it's dealing with they were complicit in it. And anyway, it deals with these. There's some stuff going on here because it deals with he could marry her, but he had to pay a fine and so forth. There's a lot going on in 13 through 30. And then verse 30, a man shall not take his father's wife. Brother Hall covered this the other night, nor discover his father's skirt, which he referred to in another place as what? His father's nakedness. So here's my point. You can go to Leviticus 18, Leviticus 20, and many other places to get more on some of these things. Can I just say this before we end? Sexual purity is a big deal to God. People can be forgiven for sexual sin, We know that, 1 Corinthians 6, such were some of you, but you were washed, justified, sanctified. But friends, let us never think it's okay. Well, everybody does it. No, they don't. Everybody doesn't do it, and it's not okay. It is a sin. And if you're not a child of God, you are in sin, you need to obey the gospel, and God will forgive you. If you're a child of God, let it not be named among you. And if you've committed that, you need to repent of it and not do it anymore, and God will forgive you if you truly repent. And if you're married or you're going to get married, keep yourself sexually pure. Hebrews 13:4 says, the marriage bed is undefiled, but whoremongers and adulterers God will judge. It's a serious thing because it goes back to the stability and loveliness of the home. There can be forgiveness, there can be repentance, but just do it the way God said do it. It's a beautiful thing. I'm glad God gave us provisions for all of this. We'll start, Lord willing, next week in chapter 23.